you take a 2,000-year-old book and my word would be pretend
Yeah.
that it's predicting what's happening in the 21st century with American bombs. So I went back to that. I mean, how do you do that? How does
Yeah.
it work? But I realized, Glenn, that if you say, okay, here's a story about the conflict between good and evil, angels and demons,
Hmm.
God and Satan, you can take that as storyline, if you like,
Hmm.
that plot line, the contrast, cosmic war. You can plug into it any conflict you want.
Hmm.
I mean, it could be a conflict you have with somebody.
Yeah.
It could be, a world catastrophe.
Hmm.
It could be people who are against you in any circumstance. So that conflict has actually, I started to look, that book has served the purpose of war for 2,000 years.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're joined by a repeat guest. Her first time on the show of the 250-ish episodes we've done. My conversation with her was one of my favorites, Elaine Pagels. Welcome back to the show. It's always an honor to talk to you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Glenn.
Thank you. So last time you were here, we talked about all things Gnostic. We jumped into your book, The Gnostic Gospels, a little bit about your story from Why Religion. But today, I want to pick your brain about the book of Revelation, a very light topic, right? Very, very easy, very, very black and white topic. Very
Depends how
simple.
you treat it, that's for sure.
That's right. So
That topic has been treated every way you can possibly imagine.
yes, I know a very narrow amount, but I'm sure there's much that I have not experienced. But you wrote a book, which I highly recommend to our listeners. It's called Revelations, Visions, Prophecy, and Politics in the Book of Revelation. So maybe we could begin really surface level. Tell us a little bit about your book, in particular the title, right? Revelations, it's plural, and talk to us about, like in the book, you talk about how the Book of Revelation is not the only revelatory text that was floating around back in the day, but it is the only one that actually made it into our New Testament. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us about that, the other books that were floating around at the time, and why this particular book made it into our Bible.
Well, you put it very well, Glenn, because many people who only know of one book with that title
Hmm.
said, she knows nothing. I mean, she doesn't even know it's called Revelation and not
Right.
Revelations.
She already got
Um,
the title wrong.
yeah, right. But it's right. I mean, along with the discovery of secret gospels,
Hmm.
I later realized, wait a minute, there's a whole lot of revelation texts. In
Yeah.
fact, that's really what many of them are.
Hmm.
And I didn't think much about it because I didn't like the book of Revelation much. When I was in an evangelical church in my high school days,
Hmm.
it was a text of fear,
Yeah.
and it's often functioned to terrify people, and it's often used that way.
Yeah.
But what happened after that is that the president of the United States, whose
Hmm.
name then was George W. Bush,
Hmm.
started a war with Iraq. I was working in Egypt,
Mm.
and I thought, how do you turn the entire Arab world against the United States when
Yeah.
they really love America? They
Mm.
want jeans, they want rock and roll. How do you do that? This
Yeah.
is how you do that. You start a war
Mm.
and you invade their country, right?
Yeah.
And it seemed to me so blockheaded. I didn't realize a lot of it was about oil and commerce
Yeah.
with Bush's oil companies and his vice president's interest in oil as well.
Mm.
Um, but I knew it was an outrageous thing to do. And what made it even worse,
Hmm.
when all the protests against the war failed and 100,000, Iraqis had died, and Bush came on and said, not one American life has been lost. And I thought, American lives are so much more valuable than everyone else's, of course.
Mm.
What is he talking about? He started a war and 100,000 people are killed.
Yeah.
He was using the book of Revelation as his propaganda.
Mm.
There was an operation, do you remember it was called Shock and Awe?
I do remember that. Yeah.
Well, what did it mean? That was NATO's term. I mean, it was the military's term
Mm-hmm.
for the operation in which American bombs pounded Baghdad.
Yeah.
And the name comes, and I didn't know this at the time, but I learned it, came from the book of Revelation.
Really?
It comes from the chapter in which there are 7 angels,
Mm-hmm.
and each angel is holding a huge bowl of the wrath of God.
Yeah.
And a trumpet sounds, and the first angel pours the wrath of God over the earth. And horrible earthquakes happen, like the one that just happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
Disasters. And then the second angel pours God's wrath on earth, and more terrible things happen. And this goes on through 6. The 6th angel pours the cup of it's not a cup, it's a huge bowl of God's wrath on the earth. And it says there's blinding light and huge noise, and people on earth die cursing God.
Mm.
And that is how they got the name, for shock and awe. It is shock to unbelievers, but awe to those who understand that the American bombs are delivering God's wrath.
Mm.
So this is a way of justifying an invasion of a sovereign country. I mean, a country ruled by a terrible man, right?
Yeah.
I do think Saddam Hussein's actions were horrendously evil. He was a brutal ruler, but it was still the invasion of a country.
Yeah.
For other reasons than the ones that were claimed. But Bush was selling it to his base, who understood the secret language is the book of Revelation, saying American bombs are delivering God's wrath. This is divine justice, right?
Yeah.
On the forces of evil. And he called them the axis of evil. And more than that, there are many, many clues in the language he used to promote that war that came out of the book of Revelation. And his evangelical brothers and sisters of the group that believed that this is really the end time, and he's making it happen in the right way.
Yeah.
So, look, nobody could stop the war at that point. But I kept thinking, how do you take a 2,000-year-old book?
Yeah.
And my word would be pretend that it's predicting what's happening in the 21st century with American bombs.
Yeah.
So I went back to I mean, how do you do that? How does it work?
Yeah.
So I went back to the book and read it carefully, and it's still a terrifying book. And as you know, it's a book about angels and demons and monsters and horrors and horrible suffering, divine judgment, God's wrath, heaven at the end. I mean, the huge contrast between good and evil. And it's all about the conflict between God's power and evil, right? And God is going to win, but not until a lot of horrible things have
A lot of
happened.
blood is shed. Yeah.
But I realized, Glenn, that if you say, okay, here's a story about the conflict between good and evil, angels and demons, God and Satan, you can take that as storyline, if you like, that plot line, the contrast, cosmic war. You can plug into it any conflict you want. I mean, it could be a conflict you have with somebody.
Yeah.
It could be, a world catastrophe. It could be people who are against you in any circumstance. So that conflict has actually, I started to look, that book has served the purpose of war for 2,000 years. Just because what I realize is it uses this kind of dream imagery, like dragons and beasts and angels, the kind of thing that comes into children's nightmares or anybody's nightmares. And whatever conflict you're in, can fit into that.
Yeah.
And that's how it's been used. Well, in the first century,
Mhm.
the writer was writing about war. He was painfully, acutely aware that his country had been destroyed by the Roman army, which is just a horrendously effective military machine
Mm.
that trampled everything under its weight,
Yeah.
And so, and his people have been destroyed, and the holy city of Jerusalem has been flattened and turned into a Roman garrison and burned down. The
Mm.
temple of God is a wreck. And he's writing about that
Yeah.
out of agony and hope,
Mm.
that God will come now and destroy the evildoers, pay them back, and restore good to the world.
Mm.
But the way it's can be used and has been used for 2,000 years is really powerful once you start looking at it.
Yeah, the way that I was brought up in an evangelical setting, and I went to a private Christian school, and I can remember in the 6th grade we had Bible class every day, and in 6th grade our teacher took us through the book of Revelation. Now I'm what, like 11, whatever age I'm in the 6th grade, and we're going through this book and we're coming at it from the Left Behind angle. And we actually watched in the class the movie A Thief in the
Yes,
Night. We watched
yes,
that movie as a 6th grader, and I was absolutely horrified. But I was so scared. Like, I had nightmares about it, and I was so scared to tell my parents because I was like, well, what if my parents don't believe? And then they're gonna tell me they do believe just to kind of calm me down, but then they're gonna go to hell. It's gonna be my fault. I had all these horrible nightmares. And then in church at the same time, the pastor was preaching about Revelation and also about First Thessalonians, where Paul talks about being lifted into the air. So we're talking about the rapture, things like that at the same time. And it was just such a horrifying time. But then I got really interested in the book of Revelation, but I only came at it from that angle because that's all that I knew. So I had like the end times charted out on my wall when I was like starting college and things like that, because that's all that I knew. And now I'm finding out, I mean, maybe that was like 10 years later, I started to really realize, well, Revelation's much more than this. Like, this is not what Revelation really is. And so finding out like some of the context that you just spoke of is so interesting to me, because there is so much more to this book than what many people have been led to believe. And I think it's been weaponized in a lot of ways, like you said, to really hurt people. I don't know if it's intentional necessarily, but I think a lot of people have been wounded and carry a lot of baggage because of the way they've been spoken to about this book.
I'm so glad you described your experience, because one of my graduate students, when I was working on this, said he was afraid when his mother wasn't with him that she'd been raptured.
Mm.
He was afraid that he was bad, he was going to be left.
Yeah.
And, and they saw that same movie, and you were terrified, he was terrified. That movie was meant to terrify you,
Yeah.
right? To scare the hell out of you, literally, so
Yeah.
that you would pray to Jesus and go to heaven,
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's quite different from the purpose for which it was written,
Hmm.
but it certainly has that effect.
Yeah, it really does. Now, you talk in the book about these other revelatory texts, and that's the thing. I could probably talk to you about that particular thing for hours because I found it so interesting, like the secret revelation of John, the secret revelation of, I think, James, maybe. I might have them wrong, but there's a whole, I think I numbered like 9 of them or 10 of them that you talk about in the book, and they all talk about so many different things. But maybe for our listeners who aren't aware of that those texts even exist, could you maybe talk about one of them, maybe that jumps out at you, and then a little bit in particular about like why a book like that was left out of our canon and this book of Revelation was invited in? When I believe, and I could be wrong, but I think the book of Revelation almost didn't make it in. Is that correct? It almost didn't
You're
make the cut.
you're totally right. Out
Yeah.
of the 27 books now in the New Testament, this is the only one that was intensely disputed up until the last minute, which is
Mm.
it's practically 400 years after the time of Jesus
Mm.
when the New Testament is put together, and there's finally a collection that's agreed upon that we still use.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I mean that book, I realized, as I said, it comes out of war.
Yeah.
and it has a great deal of anger and wrath and vengeance in it. I mean, that writer wants God to utterly destroy and punish and devastate the enemy, which
Yeah.
is Rome. And many people say, well, there's so much vengeance and bloodshed. And I mean, how could it be a Christian book? Well, it's almost not. It's written by somebody before there's what we call Christianity. He's a follower of Jesus,
Mm.
but he believes that that Jesus has given him divine visions,
Hmm.
which assure him that even though his beloved Jerusalem has been utterly destroyed, God will not allow injustice to happen forever. So
Yeah.
justice will be restored. And I thought, sort of nice Christians in the suburbs can't really get it.
Hmm.
The way you could get it if you or I were living in Syria and our neighborhoods had been blown to bits with bombs and our neighbors had been killed and they're homeless and there's no place to get fresh water. And I mean, when people are living in terrible wartime,
Yeah.
and we're seeing that now in Ukraine,
Hmm.
they really want the enemy to be crushed,
Yeah.
just out of desperate hope of getting out of that situation.
Mm.
So it's a powerful book.
Yeah.
And for many people, it was a book about hope.
Mm.
But it depends if you're on the bottom or the top. For example, the people under the throne are saying, how long, Lord? How long will you wait before
Mm.
you avenge our blood on the people of the earth? And during the time of slavery in this country, Frederick Douglass and others who advocated the abolition of slavery said, those are the souls of the slaves
Mm.
who've been beaten and whipped and killed and tortured in this country. And they're asking for justice. And God is going to give them justice. So if you're on the bottom
Hmm.
and you're one of them, it can be a message of hope. So that in African American churches, the book of Revelation is about, go do it, Lord, take care of the earth, bring justice back, make it right, make it beautiful again, make it
Yeah.
start over.
Yeah.
But the other books of Revelation are not usually about such a vast subject as really the end time, which
Mm.
that one is. What I discovered is that, like the secret gospels, they're something much more personal. They're
Mhm.
usually like, if you were having a revelation, it means that something is shown to you that is otherwise hidden, which
Mhm.
is a deep truth.
Mm.
And these are specific to each people, as they are to the author of the book of Revelation, John of Patmos.
Mhm.
So one of them that I like is called The Revelation of Zostrianos.
Mm.
And Zostrianos is a young man. He's apparently Jewish. And he says, well, I didn't understand my life. I couldn't get answers to any of the questions that I was asking about what it all means. And everything seemed meaningless to me. And I went into a depression and I decided to kill myself. So I went out in the desert
Mhm.
by myself, didn't tell anybody. I went out. And as I was about to steel myself to do it, I heard a voice that said, Sastrianos, have you gone out of your mind? And he said, he saw a kind of luminous cloud of light, a
Mm.
cloud filled with light, which seemed to come over him. And he was taken up into it and had a kind of, I don't know, he doesn't tell us, it seems like an ecstatic experience.
Mm.
And he said, comes out of it, and he said, well, now I know, I love this line, now I know that the power in me is greater than all the darkness.
Mm.
And he goes out to preach.
Mm.
So that's his revelation.
Mm.
It's a way out of depression and suicide.
Mm.
Once I was talking about the Gnostic Gospels at a bookstore, somebody in the line to get a book signed told me a story just like that. He decided to kill himself,
Mhm.
and something stopped him. And he was convinced it was a divine revelation. So those other books of Revelation are different from each other, you know?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
quite a spectrum, but they're often moments of great personal transformation.
Yeah. And why is a book like that like not included in the canon? Like why? Because I listened to you tell that story, and it's such a beautiful story that I feel like could really help people, and I feel like people could really find a deeper connection with God and even with Jesus. And like in reading something like that, like why is something like that excluded? And even now, like nobody knows about that. I mean, I didn't know about that book until I picked up your book and I read it. So I'm sure a lot of our listeners don't know of it either. But like, why is that not a widely known book?
Well, that's a really good question. Um, a very important question,
Hmm.
and we struggle with it quite a bit. I my Here's my guess.
Hmm.
If you write a book like that, you say, something happened when I was having a difficult time, and suddenly something came to me, and I understood, and this is what I saw. This is
Hmm.
what I heard.
Hmm.
Now, you're right. This could be very encouraging to people, and I think those kinds of experiences happen to people quite often.
Yeah.
And other people wish they could have experiences like that.
Hmm.
But if you're creating a church and you're the head of the church,
Hmm.
and I say to you, well, Glenn, I had this revelation, and this is what God said to me.
Hmm.
And you say, well, I don't know. That's not what I think.
Yeah.
That is, if anyone's revelation can be accepted, you can't have an authoritative, you've got to believe this. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why
Hmm.
mystics in Christian tradition were carefully monitored,
Yeah.
and they were checked by the Inquisition, because if St. John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, Catholic mystics of the 15th, 16th century, said anything contrary to the church,
Yeah.
they would be sent to the Inquisition.
Yeah.
And they were very careful about what
Yeah.
they said.
Yeah.
Because, for example, the revelation of John, you might have noticed this one too. It says the disciple John, after the death of Jesus, he was devastated with grief. So he was about to go worship in the temple, but somebody came up and said, "Oh, you're a follower of that fake Messiah.
Hmm.
You've destroyed the traditions of your fathers. You have no business coming to the temple." And John is shocked, and he turns away from the temple, and he goes out in the desert, and he's feeling worse than ever.
Hmm.
And then he said, I heard a voice. And the voice said, and it was Jesus's voice. He said, and he said to me, John, why do you weep? Why are you sad? I am the one who is with you always.
Hmm.
I am the Father, I am the Mother, and I am the Son.
Hmm.
And it's quite beautiful. But since the Catholic Church later would say, what do you mean mother? Well,
Get
we
out
talk
that.
about
Right.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right?
Right.
And
Right.
there's no mother anywhere.
Right.
Because the Greek terms, well, the Greek term for spirit is a neuter term.
Hmm.
And in Latin, it's a masculine term, because since these languages have gender. But in Hebrew, Jesus's language, Aramaic, it's a feminine term. So the spirit is seen as if you're going to put anthropomorphic
Hmm.
metaphors, you're going to
Hmm.
say God is Father, you're using a metaphor of a human relationship
Hmm.
and saying God is like that. He's like a father, and God is like a mother. The Holy Spirit is like a mother, because if you're speaking Hebrew, the language tells you that the Spirit is a feminine power
Hmm.
and the Father is a masculine power.
Yeah.
But that's not what happened in the history of the church.
Hmm.
You have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and no feminine power at all. So that would be seen by the church later as heretical.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what you don't want. So they don't like uh, these freelance revelations.
Right. Right. So then is it safe to say that like a lot of these texts then like that you mentioned, like I said, there's like maybe 10 or so of them that you talk about in the book didn't make it into the larger group of texts in the New Testament because they're encouraging people to maybe look for the truth or look for God in places other than the places the church has deemed to be appropriate. Because, like, for instance, I opened up the book while you were talking, and you have this one quote from the teachings of Sylvanus.
Sylvanus, yeah, yeah.
Sylvanus, and you have a quote here, and it says, "Knock upon yourself as upon
Ah,
a door, and walk upon yourself as on a straight road. For if you walk on the road, you cannot get lost. Open
yes,
the door for yourself, that you may know the one who is. What you open for yourself, you will open." Like that gives me chills, but it makes me
yes,
think of Jesus being the door, Jesus being the way, and in a lot of sense, like I've been taught in my life, like the church is the way, like you got to follow the way of the church. But this encourages you to look within yourself and open up the door yourself, and you will discover God in that place. And I guess for me, like thinking of what I know of the church and my own upbringing, that's like a no-no. We don't want that, right?
that is a no-no for most churches.
Yeah,
And yet they value religious experience and mystical experience. But the churches want to keep control of the message, right?
yeah, yeah.
Because people can really go off the rails. I mean, they can start feeling megalomaniac, oh, well, I'm divine,
Sure, sure.
I'm the voice of God.
Yeah,
I mean, they can get into some crazy stuff.
yeah,
So there are reasons that the church tries to keep the shape of what they call straight thinking,
yeah.
and not just say, well, whatever you find in yourself. I mean, some people say, God told me to kill my family.
Right.
Um, well, like the God of Abraham.
Yeah.
Um, but
Right. We use a biblical example.
yeah, just for example.
Right.
Um, I mean, that could be insanity, right?
Hmm.
It could happen. It has happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that, I think, is why churches are trying to be careful to curate the message.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what do we say then about think about like the book of Revelation, even these other texts? Like what are ways that people can steward, in particular the book of Revelation, that's what we're talking about. Like what are ways that people can steward that text well? Because I've heard some people say, some scholars, historians say that book really has no place in the pulpit. Like people shouldn't be preaching on it because it's such a, it's a book of bad news pretty much, and it's a book of blood and war and things like that. There's no hope in that book to be found, but you talked about hope before. And so I'm wondering, like, given people who are listening who might be reading the book of Revelation with a group, or maybe they are pastors or teachers, what are some ways to effectively use this book in a way that honors the text and doesn't manipulate it like we talked about before?
Really good question. I think of two things. One
Hmm.
is it is a book which says, um, you get what you deserve, and evil will not go unpunished.
Yeah.
That if you do something, um, if you harm and kill and destroy people,
Hmm.
something will happen to you.
Hmm.
There will be retribution for that. And if you suffer unjustly, because John wrote, because the people he knew who were followers of Jesus as he was,
Hmm.
were being put in prison and tortured and their heads cut off, or worse. I mean, there are worse ways to die than beheading.
Hmm.
Beheading was a privilege in the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
If you weren't a citizen, you could be crucified, which is, hanged up for naked for days,
Yeah.
to die really slowly, or to have the vultures pull, you know,
Pull you apart.
after your flesh while you're alive. It's
Yeah.
horrible.
Mm.
So the book is encouragement to act right. That's one thing. And it's also encouragement to people who suffer the
Hmm.
way Christians were suffering and saying, don't give up, don't
Yeah.
despair. There will be justice. I mean, Jesus was terribly tortured and crucified,
Yeah.
but he's going to come back
Mm,
and he's going to devastate his enemies
mm,
and he's going to live on earth.
mm.
God will live with human beings in you won't need a temple because God will be right here on earth and the earth will be renewed and beautiful the way it was in the beginning. So there's a lot of wonderful music, like
Mm.
I'm trying to think of the spirituals that on the book of Revelation. Well, I was thinking of Johnny Cash's song "When the Man Comes Around." That's one,
Yeah.
but that's about justice,
Hmm.
but and retribution. But many about 12 tribes in the city, hallelujah, or
Mm.
we're going to walk the streets of gold,
Yeah.
and praise God.
Mm.
So it's given a great deal of hope to people who have no hope.
Yeah.
And I think that's the appeal it has, especially, as I say, if you're the people who are suffering and not the ones inflicting that.
I think that's the way I find it because I've heard, like I said, I heard a lot of people say like it's not a hopeful book. It shouldn't be really preached from the pulpit. But when I peel away all of the baggage that I have from the book that I described earlier with the thief in the night and left behind, and I kind of peel all that away, I just try to look at the text for what it is. Like you said earlier, it is a scary text because there's a lot of scary language in there. It seems like John had too much pizza before bed when he had all these visions and he kind of wrote about all this stuff that was going on. But when I look at it in the context that you explained of what was going on in the world at the time, what these people were enduring, and I pull that into our days, whether it's a personal issue or a communal issue or a societal issue, like we all have that stuff that makes us feel hopeless. And I think that the book can inspire some sort of hope in that we do have a God, we have a divine being in the universe that maybe we don't completely understand, but that God is active, that God is working. And can we place our hope in the fact that perhaps down the road, whether it's a week, a month, a year, or 10 years from now, that there will be the things that are going on in our lives causing this hopelessness will in fact be better. I feel like that's a healthy message from the book of Revelation.
Well, it's certainly meant to be. And
Yeah.
I was just thinking of the pictures we're seeing from parts of Ukraine when they're
Hmm.
bombed out and people and they're dead in the street and
Yep.
people are being brutally murdered and shot and raped and tortured.
Yep.
Um, it's in that kind of circumstance, I think you have to imagine this book coming out of that kind of
Yeah.
terrible war,
Yeah.
um, with terrible injustice being done.
Yeah.
And the vision at the end is a glorious vision of a new earth
Hmm.
in which nobody hurts anybody and nobody has to weep and those who died are brought back alive and joyful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's not, you say that it's like it's not, I was taught to read it as this is a prediction of what's going to happen. It's a prophecy of what's going to be
Yes.
happening and how the world's going to end. But perhaps the picture, we can allow the picture to be something that evokes hope inside of us, that we hope for a day when there is a new world, when there is a new a new way that things are done on the earth, where the war is gone and the things that are happening in Ukraine don't happen anymore. Like we can let that picture inspire us to
Mm.
create a better world around us in this day and in this moment.
Well, I think that's certainly why it was written.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
it was about the end of the world, but I
Sure.
think, the conviction that the end of the world was very near is runs all through the
It's
gospel.
always been near,
It
right?
says that. It says, the kingdom of God is coming soon
Yeah.
and within your lifetime, within your generation, right?
Yep.
Well, now it's been 2000 years, but whoever wrote that really felt, okay, it's been 90 years. How do you take a 2000-year-old book
Yeah.
And my word would be pretend,
Yeah.
that it's predicting what's happening in the 21st century with American bombs.
Yeah.
So I went back to I mean, how do you do that? How does
Yeah.
it work?
Yeah.
So I went back to the book and read it carefully, and it's
Mhm.
still a terrifying book. And as you know, it's a book about angels
Yeah.
and demons and monsters and horrors and horrible suffering,
Yeah.
divine judgment, God's wrath, heaven at the end. I mean, the huge contrast between good and evil.
Mm.
And it's all about the conflict between God's power
Mhm.
and evil, right? And God is going to win, but
Mhm.
not until a lot of horrible things
A
have
lot of
happened.
blood is shed. Yeah.
But I realized, Glenn, that if you say, okay, here's a story about the conflict between good and evil, angels and demons,
Mhm.
God and Satan, you can take that as storyline, if you like,
Mm.
that plot line of the contrast, cosmic war. You can plug into it any conflict you want.
Mm.
I mean, it could be a conflict you have with somebody.
Yeah.
It could be, a world catastrophe.
Mhm.
It could be people who are against you in any circumstance. So that conflict has actually, I started to look, that book has served the purpose of war for 2,000 years,
Mm.
60 years since Jesus died, two
Yeah.
generations.
Yeah.
It's got to happen now.
It's coming.
So I think that writer certainly felt the urgency,
Mm.
and he felt that Jesus had promised that, when you see these terrible things happen at the end of the Mark's gospel in chapter 3, and you see war and armies surrounding Jerusalem and enemies and terrible things happening, then you know that the end is coming at the very gates, and the Son of Man will return in the clouds and transform the world.
Yeah.
And so it is about the end time. And I think we do need that kind of hope, that
Yeah.
otherwise people assume that the world will just end in despair and
Yeah.
devastation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. All right. Last question for you. We've mentioned his name a bunch of times, John of Patmos. I growing up, I was given, I think a lot of our listeners, probably some faulty information about John of Patmos, because I was always under the impression that this was Jesus's disciple, the disciple John. I was told that same John that wrote the Gospel of John. I was also told he wrote First, Second, Third John, which is a podcast for another day. But obviously, a lot of maybe misinformation about this particular individual. So, what do we know of this person, this author, if anything at all? And does it really matter at the end of the day what we know of him and what we don't?
Good questions. Again, that's what the church has taught. This is
Mhm.
written by the beloved disciple, the one who was next to Jesus at the Last Supper. He wrote the Gospel of John. He wrote the 3 letters
Yeah.
attributed to John.
Yeah.
Well, that's church teaching. So it's not an accident that you've heard that. You heard it well.
Yeah.
Those arguments came up in the 2nd century,
Mm.
when there were huge disputes, particularly in Egypt. What is this book? Is this genuine prophecy? The problem is, how do you know a prophecy is true? You don't,
Mhm.
until after it's fulfilled or not. So
Yeah.
if the prophet Isaiah says, we're going to win the war, and we win the war, then you put the book in the
His
Hebrew
prophet,
Bible
right?
as
Right.
inscribed.
Right.
But if he said the wrong prophecy, then you know that it wasn't inspired.
Yeah.
So John said, what does he say is going to happen? He says, Jerusalem's going to be surrounded with armies, right?
Mhm.
And and Rome is going to be totally destroyed. The enemy, the whore, the beast is
Yeah.
Rome.
Yeah.
And that empire is just going to be wiped out by God's wrath,
Mm.
right? And Jerusalem will be the center of the world again, and God's king will rule there. Well, that didn't happen. Instead, the Roman Empire became Christian. Now, that's not what John said.
Right.
So some people said he can't be a real prophet because it didn't happen.
Yeah.
But other people then said, well, some people said it was written by a heretic. It's a crazy book. It doesn't make any sense. We don't get it. And there was a lot of anger about this book, but others said, no, but you don't understand. It has metaphorical meaning. It can mean something else. It can refer to other traumas and troubles. And so it was reinterpreted. So, but to make it sound like it really belonged with the Gospels, they said, well, the writer, he says his name is John of Patmos. That must be the same John. Well, you know, there's a few he's writing decades after the Gospels, and except the Gospel of John. And there are lots of Johns in the world.
Right. Not just one.
So, but assimilating him with the disciple made the book sound legitimate. And so the people who cared about the book and wanted to preserve it and felt it spoke to them, because they were living in persecution as Christians. They were living through what John was living through, Christians being taken to prison and tortured and killed, right? And so they felt this was an important book. It spoke to their need and their need for hope. So they said, well, it was really written by the beloved disciple. Probably it wasn't. We don't know, because if you study the literary style of it, any people who've done that, even in the 3rd century, Egyptian bishop did that. He said, I looked at the way it's written completely different from the Gospel of John. I mean, the same writer doesn't write in these two really different styles. So it's only a guess. We don't know. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know who wrote the Gospel of John either, for sure. But all of these names are usually added later. And the people who wanted to include it used, you know, the name of the disciple.
Yeah. So it almost like made it more palatable, I guess, like because we have this John, he seems like a nice John. So we have this other book written by some kind of John. So if we say this book was written by the John we already know, it almost makes the book more welcoming, feel more welcoming.
Well, you know, in the New Testament, there's a letter called 1 Peter and 2 Peter. Those were written about 30 years after the death of Peter. But giving them Peter's name gives them a sense of authority that they probably wouldn't have had if they didn't have Peter's name. Or the little book of James, you know, given the name of the brother of Jesus, James, who was the leader of Jesus's followers in Jerusalem. Now, it could have been written by someone named James. We don't know. Was it written by the brother of Jesus? He died in the year 62. He was lynched in Jerusalem. So that book was probably written later. But the fact is, we don't know. There's a lot we don't know.
Now, when those decisions were made, I think it's important for people, because I think sometimes the assumption is that there was some sort of deception that was involved. Like but I don't think that was the case, if I'm hearing you correctly, right? Like, it was, people were being genuine in putting these names on the books or attaching these names to the books. It wasn't so much to deceive people, but it was a sense of genuineness to make them feel more, I don't know the word, like, not authoritative, but give them a different sense, I guess, by attaching those names to them. Yes, trustworthy. That's
they
what I'm
can
looking
trust the
for.
books.
Yes.
I mean, yes. I mean, that's a very important point you made. It wasn't meant to trick you. It can be meant to say, I'm writing in the spirit of our beloved brother Paul, or the spirit of Peter. And if Peter were here, this is what he would say. So it's not fraudulent. It's a practice in the ancient world to use the names of well-known figures to say that you're identifying with that tradition.
It's a different sense than if I were to write something and say, my name is Elaine Pagels, and I were to write it and put it out there. That would be very different than what they were trying to do, because that was a practice in the ancient days.
But you could say, this is the teaching of the prophet Isaiah, because you've been studying Isaiah, you've been preaching Isaiah, and you feel that your message is really in that spirit. I mean, but that's a practice in the ancient world. It's not considered deceptive at all.
Well, we are just about out of time. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but this has been a lot of fun. As always, I always learn from you. So thank you for your time, and thanks for taking time for my friends and our listeners.
Well, thank you. I think your questions are so wonderful, and they open up the subject in in a fascinating way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And do you want to, is there any place you want to direct people to go to online? Is there anything out there that you have worked on or are working on that you want people to
Well,
know about?
that little book, Revelation, is in paperback, of course.
Here it
And
is.
then the more recent book is called Why Religion. You've seen that one? Have you seen that?
Yes, I love that book.
That's a,
It's your story, right?
yes, that's a book I never thought I would publish because it's so revealing. I mean, when my students say they read it, I thought, whoa, you know.
Oh boy.
Ah, but I wrote it because it's true.
Yeah,
And I thought it's just the story of somebody, you know. I mean, we all have
yeah,
stories that are, I love to read people's stories myself.
yeah. Well, it's a good
Now I'm
one.
writing about the books. I'm writing about the Gospels in the New Testament,
You are.
along with the secret Gospels, along with the Jewish critics and the Greeks who couldn't stand the movement and everything else we know about them. It's
Oh,
sort of a
wonderful.
grand soup of what's going on at the time.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. When is that due to hit the public?
Well, I don't know. I hope to finish it within a few months and get it out there next year.
Excellent. Well, I'll put the links of what is out there in the show notes, and we'll do this again sometime soon.
Good talking to you. Take care.